Well, welcome again to the next session in the First Line Leader webinar series, The Best Secrets to Hiring, Coaching, and Accountability. We're so glad you could join us. Today's presenters are Pam Shade and Ann Petrie. Pam brings over 38 years of healthcare experience to her role as consultant for creative healthcare management. Her work as a direct care provider includes critical care, burn trauma, oncology, home care, and hospice. She has served in executive leadership roles in both acute and post-acute care. Throughout her career, the driving question has always been, what is the best we can do for the patient and family? And as a consultant, she transforms cultures using relationship-based care with special expertise in post-acute settings and transitions of care. She focuses on the strengths of organizations and people, building upon those for even better patient experience, employee engagement, and organizational success. Ann Petrie is a positive organizational development leader and writer with 20 years of experience driving performance improvement in organizations. She brings compassionate, innovative, and insightful energy to cultivate resilient, mindful, emotionally intelligent teams who improve their own, their clients, and their organization's performance and well-being. She is a contributing author on the forthcoming book, Advancing Relationship-Based Cultures, which will be published in early 2017. I'd like to welcome Pam and Ann to the presentation.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris, and welcome everybody. Really glad to have you with us today, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the things that is maybe most important in being a leader, and that is how to build a healthy team. Starting with hiring for the right person and then incorporating some coaching techniques to help them develop capacity and be the best they can be. So our objectives for today is that first we will describe and demonstrate some best practices for making a good hire. We'll also talk about strategies for coaching employees to build staff capacity, starting with orientation, and describe the importance of accountability in building an effective team. Leaders have a big role to play in creating a great team. Sometimes it is we inherit a team, and so we're working to develop them and help them to be what we need them to be to continue to move forward with meeting our objectives. Other times we might be starting by building a team from scratch. But hiring for the right fit is a really important role for leaders. So that's where we're going to start today. I think that if you've been in a leadership role for any length of time, you can perhaps relate to the man in this picture. Things just seem to be going smoothly. You've got everything in place and full steam ahead, and someone walks into your office with their resignation. And once you get over that little pit in your stomach about now what am I going to do, it's time to start thinking ahead. We can relate to this man in the picture because sometimes the idea of having to go through the hiring process, which we can all relate to, takes a long time. It breaks our routine, it might interfere with our plans, it disrupts our team, they might even lose focus, and sometimes we can get lost in the extra work that we have to do in order to replace someone or decide what the next steps should be. But I would invite you to think instead about the woman in this picture. And what if, instead of feeling in a hurry, feeling like we've just fallen into a hole, instead we're thinking that this is an opportunity for us, because the truth is that open positions really are opportunities for us to reevaluate and also to intentionally design the future of our team. So I would encourage you to think of this time between someone telling you they will be leaving and deciding what your next steps would be, to pause and to just reconsider what the options are. This is definitely a mindset shift because our typical response is when we hear of that vacancy, we feel an urgency to replace and to fill the hole. We have a loyalty to our team. We don't want them to be short. We want to have a full capacity so that we can keep moving forward. And sometimes we just assume that what we're doing is the right thing. And so we move forward with replacing the person who left. So if you've had a social worker on your team who left, you're going to rush to replace with the social worker. And sometimes we just get so caught up in the process of moving forward to fill this vacancy that we don't pause and evaluate. So if we shift to the right side of the screen and instead look at this as opportunity, we can use this time to really gather some very important information. We can learn from our past experience. We can review the role, and we can take a little time to think and to wonder, is there an approach that would better serve my team? So 3 steps that I would suggest to you. Very simple, easy to remember, but the number 1 on it is to plan, then to interview, and then to decide. So in that planning process, I think that one of the first things we can do is really try to find out why this person has made the decision to move to another position. I would suggest, if you have the opportunity, that you have an informal conversation with them where you just ask them some open and honest questions about what brought them to the decision to leave, what things you as an individual, as a leader, could have done that would have made working as part of your team a better experience for them. It's important to do this, to look at the past and learn from it and be reflective in that process, because we don't want to make the same mistakes twice. And if we don't fix the problems, we will find ourselves right back in this situation, and sometimes we can find ourselves in a situation where we're facing multiple vacancies. The other thing is to look at the current state. What is really needed to move the team forward? It's thinking outside the box to be sure you have the right person in the right role. And you might find that you do, and if it's a nurse who's left her position, a nurse might be exactly the person that you need to fill it. But it's important for you to step back and wonder, looking at what were the tasks, what were the things that the nurse was doing, how might this be accomplished by other members of the team, just really making sure you get the right person in the right role. The other thing to think about is your hiring team. There really is no need for you to feel like you need to soldier on and make all these decisions and do all this work on your own. And this is especially important when the person that you're hiring is going to be part of a team. So put together that hiring team. Who are the key stakeholders? Making sure that all of the people that this person will interact with on a regular basis are represented in that hiring team. You certainly don't want to get it to be too large, then it becomes a little bit unmanageable, but just thinking about what's the right number of people to have involved and what is the right makeup of the team. The other question to be answered as you put together your team is, what role will they play in the decision-making process? Are you seeking feedback from them, but you as the leader will reserve the right to make the final decision? Or are you asking the team to really help you make this decision? So to interview this person with the intention that at the end, the team as a whole will decide who the right person is. The other important part about planning is to really think about the values that you desire. Sometimes we know the skills, those are typically outlined in the job description. We know what's necessary to carry out the responsibilities of the role, but what are the values behind the task? If we're looking for someone who is a good communicator, what is it that we value about communication, and what does that mean to our team? So the values associated with communication might be around respect, trust for the team, working for the greater good with the understanding that we are stronger together and most effective when we work together. So really getting to those values. If your organization has values, you certainly want to review those and make sure that you've identified the values that are really important to you in this position. So it's looking beyond the skills. Another example of that would be if you're trying to build relationship-based care relationship-based cultures, then what does that mean, and what values do you hold that are really important for that you want to be sure that you're searching for the people that possess those values? We know that if personal values are aligned with organizational values, that we have the greater success is possible for the team as well as for the organization. So values are important. Take some time, take some conversation, but well worth your effort. Once you know those values, you can begin to move forward with designing your job posting. I know in some circumstances these are pretty much determined and standardized by the HR department, but you may have the opportunity to think about the language that you want to include in there. Then developing your interview questions. I think most use behavioral interviewing techniques, understanding and believing that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So developing those interview questions is really important, and this is where you begin to link them back to your values. An example of this might be if change is something that flexibility is your value because you are a unit or a department or an organization that frequently changes, then you might want to have an interview question that asks, tell me about a time when you experienced a significant change. If you're looking for teamwork and somebody that really is about helping the team be stronger, you might want to use a question such as, could you give me an example of a time when you really worked to build a helping culture? So thinking about linking your questions to your values is really important. Developing a rating system. I encourage you to think about something that is simple to use but also has some objective criteria that's associated so that each person on your interview team has the opportunity to ask their questions, listen to the responses, and then rate the candidate based on their responses. This can really help to avoid groupthink and can give you some opportunities to be really honest in your evaluation. You could use a system that's sort of ABC, with A being, I think this candidate knocked it out of the park, B, what I would have expected, C, really didn't answer the questions at all. You can also do a 1, 2, 3, something like that, but some way that you're going to evaluate. Another thing that can save you time in the long run is to think about doing a screening interview. This is really that type of interview that can be done over the phone, and it's about just making sure that the person meets the requirements of the job. It's not intended to replace a face-to-face interview. Sometimes these are done by your HR business partner. Other times this might be something that you want to do for yourself. It's important depending on the role. If you're hiring a case manager, somebody who's going to do a lot of work over the telephone, there can really be some value in doing screening interviews as the hiring manager so that you can hear how the person presents over the phone. Are they able to articulate well, answer the questions? So screening interviews can be a really important tool.
Pam, I love all of the points that you're making. It just also occurs to me that how important it is for us to be partnering with our HR folks as we're doing this work. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of the opportunity to really to save work up front can happen by having a close collaborative relationship with your HR partner in developing these processes if they don't exist already. And I even have heard of a number of systems out there beginning to use pre-screening assessments. And you sort of mentioned a little bit when you talked about getting to the values, and I think you had mentioned that some of your clients are doing values assessments too prior to hiring.
Yeah, they're actually doing them before even having someone complete an application. It's sort of the first step in the process. And their feeling around that is that the willingness to complete the values assessment speaks to the value that the person will hold.
That's great. I think whether your organization has the resources to do that kind of initial screening or not, I think it's all pointing to something really important, and that is sort of identifying early on what your values are of the people that you're looking for, and trying to embed the kind of discernment process throughout the hiring. Embed discerning for those values and cultural fits early on in the hiring process.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Anne. I think we've probably all learned the most from the times when we've made bad hires. So everything that we can do up front to really look beyond the skills that are needed to understand the person that's coming forward to apply for your position is a really important step. And I think one that is easy to overlook if we feel like we have the pressure of a timeline.
Yeah, so true.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Anne. Okay, so now you're all ready. You've done all your pre-screening work, you've used all the resources that you have available, you've got your team assembled, you know your questions, so it's time to begin the interview process. And I think certainly it's been my experience, and sometimes I walk away from interviewing in just really sort of feeling like this is, there's a lot of chance that's involved. And so I like to think of using the interview as a way to find that blend between skill and chance. So it's important to, especially in a behavioral interview process, to really explain what you're going to do, to be comfortable with silence, to let them know that it's okay for them to think about their answers, to ask them to be specific. So really thinking about what you want and giving the instructions to the candidate before you begin the process. The other thing during the interview, it's really important for the interview team to be attuned. It's important for you to hear, but also to note what you see, how the candidate responds to the interviews, just using all of your senses to really be tuned in to this person in front of you, because this is a really important step and you don't want to miss anything. It's important in behavioral interviews. Sometimes they can take on the kind of the flair of a conversation, and they're not a conversation. Certainly they're more than asking yes or no questions, but you're really trying to get information, and the candidate is trying to get information as well. So I encourage you to be aware of your verbal and your nonverbal responses. We can affirm or negate things just in the way that we respond to them, which can then, some people are really skilled at interviewing and they can pick up on those things, and their answers then become what they think you want to hear rather than truly how they feel or what their experience has been. So you want to avoid behavior that's leading. You know, when someone's answering a question and you're sort of starting to get involved in the conversation by saying, oh yes, I can see how that happens. It's okay to nod and acknowledge that you hear the answers, but be careful about agreeing and sort of leading them on by the way that you are responding. So being very attentive to your behavior is important. Attentive listening, let them know that you're going to be taking notes. So you want to jot down things that will help you remember, but not get too involved in note-taking that you forget to listen. Following questions. Certainly listening to what someone says, and if something isn't making sense to you or you would like a little more detail, just asking them, you know, tell me more about this. Not asking it in a way that leads them to what you want the answer to be, but certainly asking those questions that help them. I think one of the tricks that we can fall into really easily is we tell them the answer. So tell me about how you successfully navigated change. Is very different than tell me about a time when you experienced change. And hopefully through the experience they will get to how they navigated through it. But when you say how you successfully navigated it, you've just filtered out a lot of things for them. So be careful about those following questions. This is really a time for you to just be genuinely curious. Really want to get to know this person and what they have to offer. One of the things that I learned early on in my career was the importance of including a question that would give me some indication about whether or not this person would be coachable. Because in order for us to develop capacity within our staff, they have to be able to learn to think and problem solve on their own. They have to be willing to take risks to make decisions. They have to be open to feedback. So the whole idea about coachability is really important. And one that I used to use frequently, which seems a little off when you first ask it and is not always comfortable as the interviewer, but I asked someone to tell me about the name of their current supervisor, and could you spell that for me? Because being able to spell someone's name shows a level of engagement that you have with that person. The other thing I ask is, I will say is, tell me about, and I'll use Anne because that's a safe name for me to use right now, but tell me about Anne as a boss. And what they tell you will give you an idea about what they appreciated about Anne and maybe what they didn't like so much about Anne. And you can make decisions then about whether or not this fits with how you typically lead. And then the last question I ask, and this one really gets to the coachability, is what do you think is one thing you could have done or you could do to make your relationship with Anne even better? And this is that idea of sharing responsibility for the relationship. So I think these questions can really give you some insight about what it will be like for you as a leader, for you as a charge nurse, a mentor, a preceptor, whatever your role might be when you're on the hiring team, and what it will be like to move forward and help this person to develop as you would like to see them develop. So coaching questions really important. Then remembering as you score. Sometimes depending on the team, people will want to wait until the end and score. I prefer scoring as we go, and that's why it helps to really keep it simple. You might be thinking about ranking and comparing the candidates as you go along. Scoring them as you go and making notes to yourself is really important if you are not doing consecutive interviewing with candidates. So whatever you might need to help you rank them, we will compare them and then discuss them. Sometimes you want to do that immediately after the interview just to help keep it fresh in your mind, because if you wait to do that until you're finished interviewing everybody, then you might have forgotten some things that were really important to you at the time. So after we've completed the interviews, we've done our ranking, we've done our scoring, it's time to decide. So for everyone to independently do their scoring is important. You as the hiring lead might ask them to rank their top 3 candidates. And then it's really important to discuss. So to talk about it, this matters greatly when you have a wide gap between scoring. Maybe somebody thought they were great and someone didn't think they were so great. So really, what's that about? Sometimes it will just be very obvious and you all 3 will be on the same page right from the beginning, but it's still important to discuss what really stood out for you. What did you really appreciate about the candidate? What do you think the strengths are that they bring to your team? And also if there are any concerns that you have. Concerns don't necessarily mean that it's not the right person for the job, but it may mean that there's some additional work that you need to do. If you're going to do a second round of interviews, this is where you can decide what it is you're going to hone in on for that second round of interviews, and then make a decision. And this decision might be, who do you want to move forward to a second round of interviews, or you might be at the point of deciding which candidate you want to offer the position for. So this method works really for whether it's first round of interviewing or second round of interviewing. Remember, if you want to hire for fit, we can train for skill. There might be some things that are non-negotiables as far as skill, but there may be other things that are negotiable. So hiring for fit is really important. And then again, that role of team feedback. Are you listening as the hiring manager to what they have to say, or are you deciding as a team? Just a little bit more about hiring for culture fit. Really what this means is that you share beliefs and values. There's an alignment between personal mission and organizational mission, sometimes mission and values. Sometimes you may decide that having a way to better assess fit might be really important for you. This was something that we did fairly regularly when I was working in public health, because for someone who's never done that work, it's a very different type of work. So we actually would arrange for a shadowing experience, an opportunity for somebody to spend a few hours to just see what is it like to actually do the work. And you want to be sure that you pair the candidate with somebody who can really do some assessing while they're on site to see what their take is on fit. Some organizations go to extremes. UPS does this. When you interview at UPS, at least used to be, I don't know if it's still true, they actually give you a pair of brown shorts to wear during the interview. Sort of a hallmark thing of UPS, so I don't know if we want to go that extreme, but you know, that whole idea of hiring for culture fit is really a really important thing. There are also some cautions around hiring for fit too. Just to be aware of them. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, because I really do believe fit is most important. But you can find yourself where you really have a lack of diversity. So thinking back to when I mentioned about having the discussion about what do you think the strengths are that this person brings to your team, that's where you can really look to find balance within your team so that your team can be a highly functioning team. But just beware of the possibility that you will find yourself in a situation of not having enough diversity of skill, diversity of thinking, diversity of approaches, and willingness to think outside the box. We also can find ourselves a little bit in a system of groupthink when we hire too much people who are exactly like us in too many ways, sort of like the cookie cutters in the slide, and that when we have the lack of diversity and the groupthink, we can find ourselves in a situation where we potentially have some bias that might occur. So just be aware that you are really thinking this through and being thoughtful in what the person brings to your team. So when we look back to our diagram that we started with, hiring for fit was right there at the top of that diagram. The next several circles on there, one is getting off to a good start, one is helping your team to develop ownership for their practice, and then developing and building skill. And these three things a good leader can do through a practice that's called coaching. And coaching is really about empowering people to be able to think and problem solve. The interesting thing is we often think that what we need to do is give a lot of advice, find solutions for people, fix it for them. And what we really do is stifle their growth when we do that. If we give them opportunities to talk about what they're thinking about, what they would like to do, what do they think they could do to move them in the direction that would be towards their ideal, that's when the real learning and developing capacity happens. It's through that process of thinking. So it's important that we as leaders look at how we can lead through coaching. There can be two purposes for coaching. We can be leading for performance. This is about addressing behavior. So certainly that is a conversation that many of us don't like to have. It's an important one to have. It's also one that employees don't really like to receive. Coaching can create a little bit more of a safe space for that to happen and really help keep the conversation focused on the behavior and the expectations. We can also coach for development, and this is when we turn from the issues, so we're not focusing on behavior, and we're really focusing on the person. Coaching for development is a really powerful tool. It really helps to develop leaders. It also helps to develop engaged staff. And we can really help them to be successful and be their best when we appreciate them, appreciate what they're doing, help to lift up the things they're doing well, and we do all of this through a way that empowers them to own their practice, to own their role and their responsibility. So the simple premise of coaching is we talk less and we tell less and we ask more. Great leaders ask great questions. So that's the point that we want to get to. it's true that really our advice is sometimes not worth as much as we think it is. So for example, someone comes in and they talk about another coworker. They have a lot of complaints about another coworker. Our choice is you can say to them, I'll take care of it, and you can have a conversation with the person they have issue with, which then we've just formed a really nice triangle. You can say to them, well, you need to go talk to them directly, which is always good and really should be an expectation. So you can set that as an expectation. My first question for you will always be, tell me about the conversation you had with Anne about this issue. Or you can really talk, you can hear what they have to say, understand their frustration, but then you can ask them, what would be your ideal relationship with Anne? Allow them to describe what they want that to be. This is someone they're going to have to work with. They need to figure out how to get the job done. May as well have a good time while we're doing it, but help them, allow them the time to think about, in my perfect world, I would like my relationship with Anne to be this. And then your coaching question becomes, what do you think are one or two things you could do right now that would help you move your relationship with Anne in that direction? Again, we're getting back to the idea that each of us is 100% responsible for 50% of the relationship that we have with another person. So it isn't always up to somebody else to change their behavior, but that we have a responsibility as well. And that ownership of relationships, that ownership of practice is a really powerful tool. We also, when we coach, start with what rather than why. If we say, why did you choose to do it that way, that immediately puts somebody on the defense. Where if we say, what were you hoping would be the outcome of that decision, that's a very different thing. Then they can start talking to you about what they thought they were going to do, and it starts that process of reflecting of why do you think that it didn't go the way that you intended. It's also really important as a coach to suspend judgment. You really have to be willing to be an attentive listener. You have to wonder. You have to follow them in their conversation. They need to trust that you have created a safe environment in which they can say these things. They can show their vulnerabilities. The important thing, too, with coaching is to remember we don't have to have all the answers. Leaders help others discover the answers to their questions. Certainly we have rules and regulations and things like that that we cannot ignore, but when it comes to behavior and developing employees, they really have more to offer than we do. Coaching is it's an opportunity that you can use when you're checking in with a new hire. You can say, wow, you've had a really busy week, I've seen your assignments, tell me what's on your mind today. And you can just use this as something with new hires. You can use it when you have one-on-one meetings with staff. You can use it when staff ask to speak to you. It's just really a tool that can be incredibly helpful for you in all the ways that you engage and interact with staff. It takes practice, so you can always start by practicing at home, trying to incorporate some of these questions, but it really is a very powerful tool for leaders. Some questions you can consider in coaching is to say, what's on your mind today? This really keeps the conversation about what matters. You might have some agenda items, so you might say, I really need to talk to you about this. So tell me what you think about that. Tell me what your perspective is on that. I like to let the conversation evolve, and then as soon as there begins to be a lull, I just say, and what else? So that you can dig a little deeper, go a little further. Asking what is your ideal in this situation is always a great thing because that helps us, you always start with the end in mind, and then the one I mentioned before about what are one or two things that could help you move towards your ideal. And again, Listening is really important, and validating what you hear. Doesn't mean you necessarily agree with it, but it is that you validate it. So this really helps in professional development, and I have to say that when I began the practice of coaching, I think it really helped me to become a better leader as well. It felt great to know that I didn't have to have all the answers, that it was okay for us to discover and explore together, that we had expectations, we knew what our limits were, but within that limit, within that circle of possibilities, there were lots of possibilities. If you're familiar with Stephen Covey's work and the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one that he talked about was always seek first to understand before being understood, and coaching fits beautifully into that. So coaching can be a great tool, moving from hiring on to developing capacity. So any questions that we've had that have come up so far?
Okay, thanks Pam. Let me take a look here. I do have one question. It goes back to when you're talking about scoring and rating interviews. It's could you tell me a little more about how to use the scoring rating system, and do you have one in particular that you could share?
Sure. You know, I never used a really standardized thing. It was more, we usually did an ABC, so it was like having a grade. And the parameters that we associated with it was that I felt like the person really answered the questions, they went above and beyond to make sure that we understood, and also that their questions really aligned with what we were looking for. So, you know, you think about your A game, this is your A candidate. This person really did a great job. And we would score each question and then sort of look at how many A's do we have, how many B's do we have, and it just helped us then to come up sort of with that composite, that overall view. So I think ABC works really, really well. You can define the parameters, but I would suggest that you have one that's outstanding, one that is mediocre, whether you use it as a B or a 2 or whatever, and then one where you really just didn't feel they hit the mark at all with answering the question, maybe didn't even answer the question at all. So the simpler you can keep it, you don't want people as you're going through the interview to be too focused on, oh, I got to make sure I remember the scoring thing. And then when you have the discussion, people have the opportunity to talk about why they chose that scoring system or that particular score. So keep it simple.
Great, thanks. That looks to be all for now.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So Pam, one of the things that I'm appreciating about what you've been sharing up to this point is the importance of mindset. I mean, I just hear coming through what you're saying a number of times, having a mindset that is curious, non-judging, wondering, and really focusing on strengths. So yeah, and so I think, you know, one of the things, you know, for the audience, what we thought was so important to sort of dip into a little bit during this webinar was the topic of appreciative coaching. So when Pam was talking about coaching, what she was leading us to is this notion of a kind of strengths-based coaching. So we thought we'd talk a little bit more about what is that exactly. So we know from research that what we pay attention to and are curious about really forms the foundation for how we take action in creating our future. And so appreciative inquiry and coaching is a really exciting sort of model for us to use in healthcare. First, we know that positivity opens minds. We know that in the neuroscience research that we have seen that when someone reflects on a positive experience, different areas of the brain light up that are reflective to feeling connected to other people, feeling more spacious and open, versus when they're reflecting on negative interactions with people, they get into a fearful, more constricted space, and the brain sort of is telling us that we respond better to the warmth and compassion and kindness of other people. And we know also that positivity builds resources and relationships. And this is kind of interesting in the sense of network theory. So another sort of research-based notion is that when we do something or have a positive interaction with a person, so a manager to a staff member, it impacts not only that immediate staff member, but it impacts the staff member, the next person that staff member interacts with, and then the person after that. So a factor of 3. So imagine the power, the ripple effect, when we are able to engage our staff in a positive way, how that ripples out to our team, to our unit, to our system. And it furthermore has a kind of a buffering effect and creates resilience. So there's a lot of new research that's happening that's demonstrating that by focusing on our strengths, we are able to be more, I mean, it sort of makes sense, common sense. We're able to manage more complex, stressful situations because we feel that we have the confidence in our ability to manage. And then lastly, this idea of tipping point, which I really want to drive home to everyone that's listening. If you haven't heard this before, it's been a critical thing in my own life that I've used, including with my husband. So the idea is that negativity is much stickier than positivity, unfortunately, and it has to do with our evolution and how we evolved as a species. But essentially what we're learning now that we don't need to worry about our own physical safety, what we need to take away is that it takes almost 4 positive comments to have the impact of 1 negative comment. So think about that for a second. Just invite you to pause and think about the last team meeting that you were in. And maybe someone made a negative comment towards a person who wasn't even there, or towards the experience or the situation in the team. And think about the fact that it takes 4 positive comments to sort of bring back the team to a more positive space. And the same goes for our coaching with individuals. So if we're going to offer constructive criticism, for example, which we will need to do in our roles as leaders, the idea is that if you're going to offer one, opportunity for improvement, try to also then bolster that person with 3 or 4 things that you notice that they're doing well. So just some tips about what the research is showing us and how that feeds into our appreciative coaching practices. So we know that in healthcare, there's been a long history of focus on deficits. I mean, healthcare and medicine are really based on finding the problem, finding the illness, finding the disease, and fixing it. So it's no wonder that this kind of deficit theory of change is pervasive in Western medicine. But what we're learning, and I had sort of a I don't know if beautiful example is the right word, but a very poignant or meaningful example of this come home to me when I was visiting with a healthcare system and we were working on their patient satisfaction scores. But essentially, I was brought in to help improve their HCAHPS and CGCAHPS scores, which really, is kind of neither here nor there. The leadership felt that one of the ways to address their HCAHPS scores was to focus on the problems. So here, analyzing the root causes of the low scores, creating a plan. And in fact, this leadership team had even gone so far as to they decided to bring in patients who had had bad experiences to the nurse manager meetings so they could share their bad experiences. And I don't probably need to tell you that there was a sense of really just heartbrokenness and loss of morale when the staff sat with patients who had had bad experiences. And that's not to say, and I want to just pause here and have really make an important point, that we as an organization, and I personally believe there's a very important place for root cause analysis and lean work and interventions that are meant to get at specific problems that arise. I think what we're talking about here is more of a philosophy of how we perceive the best way to go about change, both individually and organizationally. And if you want to go to the next slide, one of the things that I witnessed up close and personal with this particular organization was the unintended consequence of this leadership team's decision to focus on patients who had had bad experiences. Was it created a sense of cynicism and spirals in deficit language that you see here, and sort of fragmentation and fear. And it was never the intention of leadership to create that. It's just that when you realize where we find meaning in our work, and you can go to the next slide, we find meaning in our work in the interactions that are often invisible in plain sight. And that is really the positive, healing, meaningful interactions that we have with patients day in and day out. And so what this organization decided to do when they realized that their intervention to improve HCAHPS and CGCAHPS scores wasn't working was they decided to flip it. And they began to study where there was positive interactions with patients occurring. And this became especially powerful for the managers and supervisors in their appreciative coaching with staff, because all of a sudden they were beginning to think about the questions they could ask staff that would give the data meaning. For example, let me just say that if a data point that your organization is really interested in is nurses listening to patients, for example, one of the points that we began to think about is, tell me a time when you felt that you were able to really connect with a patient and that it was a really meaningful connection. What happened? What were the mechanisms that had to be in place for you to be able to do that? And so all of a sudden we were beginning to get at really important things: structures, processes, those kinds of things, in addition to just the way that the human interaction happens on that unit or floor. And the energy in the room completely shifted when we started to ask the questions about when you had interactions that were meaningful, when you left work at the end of the day and you felt fulfilled and grateful for the day, as opposed to like burned out and exhausted. And so, think about, moving from, instead of employee retention, right? Like you think about, you don't just want to retain your marriage, right? You want to be engaged and flourishing. You want your marriage to flourish. You want your team to flourish. So we're not just trying to sustain. We really want to think about flourishing. And so the ability to reframe how we coach our staff really it's crucial, right? So moving on to the next slide, we're really thinking here in terms of appreciative coaching as tuning into an amazing energy source that's somewhat invisible but always present. and that is tuning into the parts of our day and our work that give us meaning, that give us a sense of accomplishment, that help us feel that we're making a difference, and having fun. And so appreciative coaching, and you can go to the next slide, is really about asking powerful questions. And, you know, there are two tools that I kind of want you guys to take away today, and that is, one tool is the idea of pivoting. So if you're in a team meeting or in an interaction with a staff member or someone that you're, one of your, the people on your team that you're managing, thinking about whenever you're in an interaction with them and it begins to turn negative, or you notice that it begins to be focusing on what's not working, how can you pivot the conversation toward something like this? What, you know, what created positive energy in that interaction? How did it feel to be a part of it? What did you learn? So it's not that we're being Pollyannish or dismissive of the, you know, truly awful things that sometimes happen, but it's trying to look for the nuggets of good that we can find and the positives that are amidst sometimes the really crappy stuff that we might be encountering in the day, and magnifying those and looking at how we can learn from the positive.
Thanks, Anne. I just appreciate this so much, and I have just seen the power that it has for people when you can ask them, you know, tell me what happened to you today that really made you feel like you were part of a team. And the really interesting thing about that is you talk about what you expect and what you want. I want you to feel part of a team. And then when they lift it up, you have the opportunity to go and share that with somebody. And, you know, I think we can all think back to how many times we felt like all we heard was the negative and nobody, and we really are doing good things. And so that idea of you get more of what you pay attention to is so important. And I agree with you. It can just change your life completely. It can be really great at work and at home. So
I forgot to mention, Pam, I said there were two tools. One was pivoting.
Yep.
The second tool was this notion of being with. And you know, it's really piggybacking on what you were saying, and that is the ability to be with your staff and be present and attune and tune into them. So that was just the other thing I wanted to point out.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And on your comments about positivity and mindset, you know, if we view our staff as people who are really trying to do a good job every day, and some days are better than others, but they're out there doing their best, and they're doing hard work. That changes our mindset. Instead of looking at them as people who are getting in your way or not doing the right thing, it just changes the look on your face right from the very beginning. So an appreciative mindset for the work of your team. You can't do it without them. You know, it's a symbiotic relationship between leader and their team. So it's just really important that we look at all the different ways that we can appreciate them, not saying that we ignore the things that need to be addressed, but again, it's about behavior, not about the person. And with appreciative coaching and appreciative inquiry, you're really looking at the person and the connection there. So thanks so much for that.
Yeah.
We do have some coaching resources here for you. Lots of good things out there that you can find. Coaching for Commitment was probably the first book I ever read about coaching, and attended a webinar or a workshop that were done by the authors of the book. Really great one. The newest one I read is The Coaching Habit. Say Less, Ask More, and Change the Way You Lead. Another really good coaching book. And certainly you can find some appreciative questions and things like that available on the internet as well. Just make sure they're tied to your values. So one last thing to quickly talk about around accountability. And, you know, it's really important about understanding what it means to be accountable. And being accountable means that you own the outcome. whether it's a positive outcome or a negative outcome. We own it. And if we have a negative outcome, looking at what might have contributed to that and what might we do it differently is really important. So with accountability, we own the results, we reflect on those results, and we learn how did we get there and how did that help us. Accountability is a really important part for each of us to accept in our own practice. So in some ways, I am accountable as a leader for the effectiveness of my team. And if I own that and I understand what my ability is to influence that, that gives me a sense of ownership. So I bring up this accountability cycle, which was developed by one of our colleagues, Donna Wright, and it's really about the manager's responsibility in helping people to understand and accept their own accountability. So we have our broad vision and our goals. Every leader knows what they're trying to create or should have spent a little time thinking about that. We have the responsibility to articulate those expectations about how we see ourselves as an effective team and what does it mean to be an effective team through your lens. We understand that when our expectations are not met, there are two steps to that. First is looking at the group. Like you mentioned, Anne, when you started to be able to identify structures and processes and barriers that were preventing from getting to the outcome, that's what this group assessment is about. There's individual performance assessment. So is there something that we need to do to help build the competency of an individual? And when we've determined that it's not an issue with structure and barrier, it's not an issue with competency or education, that it really comes down to a choice that someone has made to behave in a way that doesn't help our team move forward. It really, we as leaders own the responsibility and the accountability to follow through and respond. If we don't, if we allow that bad behavior to continue, then what we do is set a very different expectation for our team. So when we do all of these things right that we've talked about earlier, but we fail to follow through on that accountability piece, that's where we really begin to let our team down. So we need to correct those behaviors so we're always moving forward. We have the right members on the team. We're coaching them for performance as well as development. We're holding accountability ourselves and expecting others to hold it for their own behavior, and that is the pathway that will take us to a strong, effective, and healthy team.
Well, thanks Anne and Pam for a great session, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this session. We look forward to seeing you at a future session, and we hope that you have a great day.